So I'm going to talk about GitHub automations with you today. I'm not affiliated with GitHub. I think that's important to say today because there's later another workshop on the same topic. So I'm Severin. I'm from the Open Telemetry project. Until recently, I worked at Cisco. Soon I will work at a company called Causally. But yeah, thank you. The reason why I do this talk is there's of course always the selfless reason, right? So I hurt myself a lot by doing GitHub Actions and figured out hey, there's something to teach about. But there's also always the selfish reason, right? Where you say hey, I want others to do talks like that, right? So this is a 101 talk, a little bit more introductory into this topic. But maybe you're better than me in this topic, or maybe my future me is better in this topic, and maybe next year we can have a deep dive into certain topics of that, right? So this is now more around why are we doing this, how are we doing this, what are we doing? So I at least think that being a maintainer is fun. It feels like this guy here, right? You take all the small Lego bricks and put them into a wall and figure out how to make things better. But there's a big problem. You have to do the same thing once or twice, again and 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 again. And it's getting annoying, right? I mean, we all know it I don't know, you have to label your issues, you have to assign an issue to someone, you have to run linters, you have to do spell checking, all those things you have to do again and again. And we also all know that what we need to do to fix this is automation, right? But there's a problem. I mean, there's always an XKCD for that, right? I was looking for another XKCD about automation. I think there's at least 2, so maybe 3 or 4. So it's a repeating pattern. So what we want to talk about today is okay, how can you automate things without hurting yourself? And I want to talk about 4 topics. And the first one is the most important one. Is hey, there's a lot of good stuff out there already. So use that before doing anything yourself. And then the next step is go half the mile, right? Do some manual scripts, some scripts, you run them locally, and then later think about full-featured automation. And then, of course, let's learn the basics. Let's use some modern LLM tools to automate that. And then at the end, let's talk about some common issues of this topic. Of course, you will hurt yourself on the way doing that. So yeah, it's not a feature-perfect thing, but I said I learned my lessons, and I want to share them with you. Yeah, as I said, let's reuse what's out there. I want to introduce a few really cool things you can do today already without even writing a single line of code, right? I think that's the thing you should be doing first. Who of you is using code owners in their repository already? Okay, so I don't have to talk about them. Who's using code owners beyond the first line, putting something there, star, and then a group of people? Okay, a few less. So the cool thing with code owners is to get you started, if you have multiple folders, for example, you have a documentations folder or you have a folder per component, what you can do, you can put lines into this code owners file and say hey, those people here are responsible for this and that component, those people over here are responsible for this and that component, and GitHub is then automatically assigning them. And if you do the settings as outlined at the bottom of this page, they're required to review that to merge a pull request, right? A limitation to that is that they need write permissions. So if you ever run into that, there's of course alternatives to that. But when I do a new repository or when I start a new project, that's one of the very first things I do. I create a group and I add this code owners files and then I evolve it from there. And then maybe over time I figure out hey, maybe I need something else. And then there's other GitHub actions that can do this a little bit more fine granular. Similar to Dependabot. Now, I guess if I ask the same question again, who's using Dependabot or Renovate? I guess I get a lot of hands up again. So yeah, I think that's another easy thing to do, right? I mean, you add this to your repository. You don't even have to configure anything. There's a config file for Dependabot. And one thing you definitely should put here is the GitHub Actions to have them updated as well, right? I mean, they become a security issue. And we heard about this just recently, and I think we will hear about that in the afternoon as well, so make sure that you update your GitHub Actions as well. One thing I also like very much is that, of course, GitHub has a lot of GitHub Actions themselves you just can use. Labeler, stale, add to project are the classic ones. Labeler, for example, is definitely one you should be using to label your issues. So very much combine it with code owners, and Labeler is already like doing 80% of your project management, right? So Stalebot, if you ever have used a repository and there's then the GitHub bot telling you like, hey, this issue has not been responded to 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, now I'm closing that, that's that GitHub action, right? So you can just go to those repositories, copy a template, put it into your repository, and you're good to start. So once again, you're not doing a lot of coding and working until now. There's another one, and this is one I have to admit I have not been using for a very long time and like hurt myself a lot by doing that. So a thing you might be doing in your repository is building containers. And then, of course, Docker comes to mind. They have a set of actions you can use out of the box. One I knew very early on is like the login action, so you can log into Docker Hub, but also to the GitHub registry. There's, of course, one to, I don't know, set up Docker build, to build and publish the images. So those were the things like I learned from others, so I looked around what other people are doing, and then were like, oh, that's really cool, let me reuse that. But one thing I figured out to admit like a few weeks ago is that there's also a metadata action that helps you to do all the tagging and labeling and annotations and those kinds of things. And somewhere in a graveyard I have at home, there's like a lot of bash scripts I wrote at some time to figure that out myself. And I saw some projects doing the same thing. So if you do that, like if you want to have your latest managed, your Semver version managed, look into this action. This is a really, really cool action that you can use to build your containers, right? I highly can recommend that. And then, of course, one very important one for your security, and this is also one I neglected for some of my repositories for far too long, which is the OpenSSF scorecard GitHub action. And the reason why I did not do it, it was also like, yeah, I have to sit down and write another workflow, and yeah, let me do this later someday. And the cool thing is there's also like a, maybe not one-click solution, but a few-click solution where you get this thing into your repository. And the cool thing about that action is that when you run it, you get a really, really valuable report that will tell you like, hey, your repository has a set of security issues that you can solve maybe easily by, I don't know, setting up your branch protection, adding your code owner's files, adding maybe one or two additional workflows that help you to protect it. It even detects some vulnerabilities in certain places. So this is also definitely a low-hanging fruit I highly can recommend that you add into your repository, right? And there's many more that you can use. So again, before you start writing your own, and we get into this in a minute, go to the marketplace and you will find a lot of actions and apps and whatnot. But of course, with like any dependency, pay attention. There's security concerns with that, right? I mean, we heard it just recently that like there was one GitHub action under attack, and there was a try to extract security or privacy information from or secure information from a repository. So if you have been using this action, you might have experienced this firsthand. So what you should be doing, of course, verify your actions, who is doing that. So for example, if you use certain linters in your project, sometimes they have even their own GitHub action already. So maybe use that versus one that has one GitHub star and is used maybe by 2 or 3 other people. Then pin your versions and then use Dependabot to keep them updated. And then, of course, make sure that you like set the right permissions, use the tokens correctly. We will talk about this a little bit towards the end of my talk. Cool. That's like the easy part, right? This was everything where I wanted to tell you, like, hey, there's amazing stuff out there, so don't hurt yourself. Use the things that are people using already. Now we get into the danger zone, where you write your own stuff. And here's like my recipe, how I do it today. And again, I have to admit, I tried it the other way around, like starting with the automation immediately and hurting myself a lot. And what I do today is like, I sit down and write, I don't know, a bash script, some JavaScript code, whatever you fancy, maybe Python, maybe PHP. And you put this into your repository and you run it whenever you need it, right? So one script I use for a few years now in the OpenTelemetry documentation is just a script that checks a set of URLs if they're still active or if I need to update them. And I always think about like, yeah, I need to turn this into automation, but for whatever reasons I don't do it because it's still like so many steps required to fix it automatically that I'm like, hey, once per month I run this script, and I have a few other ones like I run manually, and then maybe later I think about automation. So this is like, yeah, the first step to the recipe. And then learning the basics is, yeah, fairly easy, I think. So if you look at this, so let's say you have a script in your repository, this is all you need, right? So this is the most basic outline of a GitHub action. So you tell it like, hey, when do you want to run it? And there's a lot of things when you can run it, like when a PR is opened, when an issue is opened, when a PR is updated, et cetera, or a schedule, as you can see it here. One thing I always recommend also, like while you're still building, is the so-called workflow dispatch. This is a thing you can do like trigger manually. So this is still like going half the way to full automation. That you still like, hey, I have a GitHub action and I can run this by the click of a button. This is especially helpful when you run your script locally, put it then into the GitHub runner, and it's not working as expected, which happens most of the time. Then you can use the workflow dispatch and try it out a few times and figure things out. And then you give this thing a list of jobs. They run in parallel, but very often you just start with one. So let's say here's my script. We run it on an Ubuntu machine, and then you have like a list of steps that are executed sequentially. Very often, the very first step is checking out the repository and then running your script, right? And that's it, right? So that's like the very basic construct of doing it. And if you understand that, the thing I do nowadays is use an LLM, right? I mean, this is like the AI slide of this presentation. I mean, I think you need to have one today. But this is really something like the LLMs can do decently well. It's like, hey, I need a GitHub action that creates a survey when a PR gets closed. And by the way, make sure that you follow some security best practices. And the other thing I always tell it is use the GH tool. So otherwise, it sometimes uses curl or some other weird way to interact with the GitHub API. And the output of that is already fairly usable. So this is almost what we use today in a few of the OpenTelemetry projects. So every time like a PR gets closed, there's a survey attached to an issue that says like, hey, thank you for your contribution. Can you answer one or two questions about your experience here, right? And as you can see, it takes care of a lot of things. You would have read through the through the GitHub documentation for that. So like, trigger this on a pull request being closed. Make sure that the permissions are set correctly so that it's only having write permissions for pull requests because it needs to make a comment. And then it makes sure that it's also checking for the PR being merged and not like other cases of it being closed. And then, setting the survey URL and then using the GH command to send the comment, right? So this is like a skeleton. I think that's really something where LLMs can be extremely helpful because like the GitHub Actions have this fairly well-structured form of YAML code, but then we get to the pitfalls, to the things that can go wrong. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong or can go kaputt, as we say in German. And it very often looks like that. So if you ever did GitHub Actions, This is probably something you see, like this is from a few months ago, but this was like, I don't know, every few minutes, like I tried it again, I did another commit, I tried it again. Because there's a few common issues you run into, and one of them is like the good old, yeah, it works on my machine, but it just did not work on the GitHub runner. That's like 50% of the problems, and the other 40% of that is like permission and token issues, and then there's probably a few other ones I have not thought about. And the first one, I have to admit, I run into this all the time. Also, I should know better already. Because like, hey, on my local machines, I use different software versions and variants. So one thing that happens to me all the time is like I use the date and the set command. And then like I use macOS, and they don't use GNU utils. And then date command behaves completely differently. So then you put it on the GitHub runner, which is an Ubuntu, and then date is different. So this is like basic, not very smart me, but you see the issue, right? So this is something you have to think about. Or the other one is, of course, the classic, like, yeah, you have some local path, and then remote, it's working differently. Or environment variables you have locally, and then you have not thought about, like, hey, they are resolved differently on the remote machine. The very first thing to fix that is, of course, like, check what they have on the Ubuntu runners or the macOS runner or whatever runner you're using. And then there's a tool called act you can use for that. So for the first one, it looks a little bit like that. So you see like, okay, here's like the Ubuntu runner, what it has, and there's a long list of things it has installed. There's also, for example, this thing with Bash. I think macOS, for example, still has a very old Bash version as a default, or I use different shells from time to time, and then suddenly things behave very strangely. And this is then this command line tool called act. Has anybody here used it? How's your experience? Good, bad, medium? Medium, yeah. I would love to hear like from anybody who says like, hey, I have figured out how to use this, because it has a few issues. One is like, I think you need to download like a 75 gigabytes GitHub runner image, which is like, yeah, depending on your machine and depending on your setup, like something very excessive. And then there's like some trimmed down versions, which brings you back to the thing you wanted to solve. Sometimes it does not do the things you expect it to do. And then last but not least, it has the same issues here. They're like, sure, it can fix a lot of problems with like versions and variants and whatever, but not permissions and token issues. And they are like, I don't know, they keep me awake at night, right? Because they're like, you always have the feeling like, hey, I figured it out. So you saw like this action we had like for starting the survey on like when a PR was merged. But we wanted to restrict that. We said like, hey, we only want to add this survey when a person is not a member of our org, because we said like, hey, I can interact with my maintainers and with like the people that regularly come to my repository, but we wanted to do this for people that maybe not interact very often with our repositories. So we wanted to make sure like, hey, only add the survey when a person is not a member of the OpenTelemetry org. And getting that working, I think it took us like, I don't know, 20 to 30 tries, because something was wrong with any kind of token. And if then one thing worked, it did not work with the other one. And I still don't have a good recipe for fixing that. So if anybody here has like good solutions for that later, if we have a few minutes, I want to hear about that. What I do today is like I read a lot of the GitHub documentation. They're fairly good for that. I explicitly set the permissions for the GitHub token if I use it, to know like, okay, I gave it this and that permission, so then I know like what the different steps are. And then sometimes you have to use different tokens. So to set the permissions for the GitHub token, it looks like that. So you say like, hey, I want to write on the contents, and I want to write on pull requests. And otherwise I want to have read permissions or no permissions. So this is something you can control for the GitHub token. This is like a token that's generated for this one run and has the permissions you give it. And if this does not work, you can use like a personal access token for like, I don't know, you have maybe a bot account on GitHub, and you can distribute this across your projects. And then, of course, you have to right-size that token. But then you have to also figure out, like, OK, when to use which token, which is like, yeah, something I still have questions on myself. And this is maybe, as said at the very beginning, this is my selfish reason for doing this talk. If you have good experience with that, I would be highly excited to hear a talk about that and how to navigate using tokens on your GitHub Actions, because I find this still very complicated and, yeah, very challenging. But yeah, this was just a quick look into this challenge. And that was my introduction into GitHub Actions. So remember, use the things that are out there already. If you don't find them, don't go the full mile already, right? I mean, think about the things you can do locally and then build it from there, because you will hurt yourself the moment you start building GitHub Actions. Yeah, I think I'm good in time. We still have time for questions and comments. So if you know how to do tokens, please come to the mic and give us a 10-minute introduction into that. If not, if you have any questions, any comments, we can use the remaining time.
All right, so here's my talk on tokens now. So I wanted to ask about making the decision. So I find, as you're kind of like looking for exemplars across GitHub Action workflows, I find that people shove a lot of the logic into actions, which makes it very hard to test locally. So for you, what is kind of your boundary between like, I need to do this locally, I need to do this in the script, or it's better off if I do. So like you mentioned like the Docker stuff, right?
Yeah.
So Docker login, and but there's also like matrices on actions, right? For running multiple architectures. Should I do that should this be a makefile? Should this be, should this be code? Should this be something else, right? So like, what's your boundary between like doing something locally and doing it within actions?
Yeah, I mean, that's my personal thought on that, right? I mean, people tend to be different on that topic. If I reuse something, I would see that I put as much as possible into the workflow, right? And if they support strategies already, and if they support running on multiple architectures already, awesome. The Docker stuff is doing a lot of those things. So really try not to mix this with any scripts in between. And I have one repository right now. It's really just one Docker action after the other and nothing I do myself. The moment I start writing my own stuff, I tend to do as much as possible in the script because it's much more testable then, right? Because it's much harder to say like, okay, I now run all of this locally, but now it's not working remotely, and then I have to dissect it again and say like, hey, there's something in the workflow and there's something in the script, and how are those things interacting? So that's like my rule of thumb. I think a small exception to that is like, again, if there's something reusable for that. So for example, there's a good reusable GitHub action for creating and managing pull requests by, I think it's a GitHub employee. I have to look it up. I don't remember the name right now. That's something I also then maybe do, that I say like, hey, maybe there's like a piece of that. But yeah, rule of thumb is like, if I have to write it myself, I try to put as much as possible into the script. And then the GitHub action should look more like the one I had here, as basic as possible, right, to reduce complexity. Questions or comments? I said I'm also excited to hear your thoughts on this topic, or if you say like, hey, I have some experience with certain topics, I'm here around for the whole day to chat about this topic. if there's no other questions, I thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, see you around.